fluorescent lights overhead didn't just illuminate the warehouse. They hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to sink directly into my marrow as I sat alone in the windowless shipping office. Working the graveyard shift at the North End cold storage facility felt less like a job and more like being buried alive in a tomb of concrete and corrugated steel. My task was simple enough. I was to monitor the temperature gauges for the massive industrial freezers and sign off on any late-night freight arrivals that happened to roll in before dawn. Most nights, the only sound was the distant groan of the cooling units, but at exactly 3:15 in the morning, a heavy, rhythmic pounding began to echo against the loading dock doors. I checked the digital manifest on my monitor, but the screen was a blank sea of black and gray, showing no scheduled deliveries for at least another 4 hours. I stared at the closed-circuit television feed, watching a rusted, unmarked white box truck idling in the gravel lot with its headlights turned off, which was the first red flag that sent a cold shiver down my spine. When I finally cracked the heavy steel door to investigate, a man stood there dressed in a faded gray uniform that bore no company logo or name tag. He didn't speak at first. He simply handed me a crumpled, grease-stained clipboard and gestured toward the back of his truck with a jerky, unnatural movement of his head. I looked down at the paperwork, but the ink was smudged beyond recognition, and the sender address was listed as a location that I knew for a fact had been demolished 3 years ago. I told him that I couldn't accept the load without a digital confirmation, but he just stared at me with eyes that looked like 2 glass marbles reflecting the sickly yellow light of the warehouse. He leaned in closer, and I could smell the overwhelming scent of stale copper and industrial cleaning chemicals radiating off his skin. The doors only open from the inside once the sun goes down, he whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement, and before I could respond, he turned and walked back into the darkness of his cab. I retreated into the office and slammed the door, locking the deadbolt with a trembling hand while my mind raced to make sense of his cryptic warning. Why would he say the doors only open from the inside? I reached for the telephone to call my supervisor, but the line was completely dead, producing nothing but a hollow, echoing silence that felt heavy in my ears. I looked back at the security monitors and felt my heart skip a beat when I realized the white truck was no longer in the loading bay, yet I hadn't heard the engine start or the tires graveling on the pavement. A moment later, a loud, metallic clatter erupted from the back of the warehouse, near the emergency exit that led to the restricted chemical storage area. Someone was inside the building, and they weren't just walking. They were moving with a heavy, dragging gait that suggested they were hauling something substantial across the concrete floor. I grabbed my heavy industrial flashlight and began to move through the rows of towering metal shelving, my breath hitching in my chest as the temperature began to drop rapidly. The thermostat on the wall showed that the main floor was plummeting towards zero, which was impossible unless someone had manually overridden the safety bypass in the mechanical room. As I turned the corner of row 12, I saw it. The heavy sliding door to the main freezer was standing wide open, its thick rubber seals torn away as if someone had used a crowbar to force it. Inside the freezer, hanging from the meat hooks that were supposed to be empty until Friday, were several dark, heavy bags that I didn't recognize. My curiosity was warred with a primal sense of dread, but I had to know what was happening in my facility. I stepped into the freezing fog of the locker, the air so cold it felt like needles pressing into my eyes, and reached out to touch the nearest bag. The plastic was wet and sticky, and as I pulled back my hand, I saw a dark, viscous smear of crimson on my palm that didn't belong in a vegetable storage unit. At that exact moment, the heavy freezer door behind me began to slide shut with a slow, deliberate hiss of hydraulic pressure. I lunged toward the gap, my boots slipping on the frosted floor, and managed to jam my flashlight into the frame just before the door sealed me in. The metal groaned against the flashlight's casing, and through the inch-wide crack, I saw the man in the gray uniform standing there, holding a large pair of bolt cutters. He wasn't trying to leave. He was methodically cutting the wires to the interior emergency release handles, ensuring that once the door was shut, there would be no way out. "You weren't supposed to check the inventory tonight," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion as he leaned his face against the glass viewing port. I kicked the door with everything I had, the impact jolting through my leg, but the heavy steel didn't budge more than a fraction. I realized then that he had disabled the external power to the motor, meaning the door was now a multi-ton weight that I couldn't move by hand. I looked around the freezing room, desperation clawing at my throat, and spotted the overhead fire suppression pipes running along the ceiling. If I could trigger the alarm, the system might automatically override the door locks or at least alert the local fire station. I climbed up the freezing metal racks, my fingers numbing until they felt like wooden pegs, and used a heavy wrench to smash the heat-sensitive glass bulb on the nearest sprinkler head. Nothing happened at first, and for a terrifying 10 seconds, I thought the lines had been drained for the winter. Then, a deafening roar of rushing water filled the room, and the strobe lights of the fire alarm began to flash, casting a chaotic, pulsing red light across the rows of mysterious bags. The high-pitched shriek of the siren was so loud it was painful, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Outside the door, I saw the man's expression shift from cold indifference to genuine panic as the exterior floodlights of the warehouse kicked on and the sirens of a nearby patrol car began to wail in the distance. He knew his window of time had slammed shut, and he fled toward the back exits, leaving the bolt cutters on the floor. The fire department arrived within minutes, and they had to use the jaws of life to pry the frozen door open enough for me to crawl out, shivering violently from the early stages of hypothermia. When the police searched the warehouse, they found that the delivery driver had been living in the crawl space above the freezers for weeks, using the facility to hide stolen goods and far worse things that they wouldn't even describe to me. They never caught him that night, as he vanished into the woods behind the loading docks. But they did find a small, hand-drawn map of the office in his nest, with my shift schedule circled in red ink. I never went back to that warehouse, and even now, years later, I can't stand the sound of a humming refrigerator without checking the locks on my bedroom door twice. I survived the night, but the feeling of being watched from the darkness of a cold room is a shadow that I don't think I'll ever truly escape. The heavy iron gates of the St. Jude's Hospital Annex creaked under the weight of the midnight wind, sounding like a dying animal gasping for air in the middle of the city. I had taken this job as a night watchman because I thought it would be easy money to sit in a booth and watch monitors, but the annex was a skeletal remains of a building that was half demolished and half rotting. The air inside smelled of wet plaster, old medicine, and something metallic that I could never quite identify, but it always made the back of my throat feel tight. My flashlight beam cut through the thick dust motes dancing in the hallways, illuminating the peeling wallpaper that hung like strips of dead skin from the walls. Every 20 minutes, I had to walk the perimeter of the third floor, which used to be the intensive care unit, and every time I stepped onto those floorboards, I felt like I was trespassing in a place that didn't want me there. I was sitting in the small, cramped security office on the ground floor, staring at the grainy black and white feeds of the 12 cameras that were still functional. The screens flickered with static, showing empty hallways and shadowed doorways. But at exactly 1 a.m, Camera 7 caught a movement that made my blood turn to ice. A shadow, taller and thinner than any person I had ever seen, glided across the end of the north corridor on the 4th floor. I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the warm glass of the monitor, and watched as a pale, dirty hand reached out from the darkness to slowly pull a heavy wooden door shut. There shouldn't have been anyone in that wing because the stairwells were supposed to be padlocked, and the elevator had been decommissioned for over a decade. I picked up my radio, but all I got was a burst of white noise that sounded like someone whispering my name through a mouthful of sand. I knew I had to investigate, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run out the front doors and never look back. I grabbed my heavy mag light and began the long climb up the central staircase, the echoes of my own footsteps sounding like someone was following me just 3 paces behind. When I reached the 4th floor, the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my own breath swirling in the air like a ghost. I walked toward the door I had seen on the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the hinges let out a high-pitched scream that vibrated through my very teeth. The room was an old patient ward, filled with rusted bed frames and tattered privacy curtains that swayed in a draft that shouldn't have existed in a sealed building. As I panned my light around the room, I saw something that made me drop my flashlight, the heavy metal casing clattering loudly on the tile. Tacked to the center of a moldy pillow on the far bed was a single, fresh Polaroid photograph. I knelt down, my hands shaking so hard I could barely pick up the light, and looked at the image. It was a picture of me, taken from a high angle, showing me asleep in the break room chair from my shift the night before. I hadn't been alone in that office, and whoever had taken the photo had been standing directly above me while I was vulnerable. I looked up at the ceiling and noticed a rectangular ventilation grate that was slightly askew, with dark smudge marks around the edges where fingers had gripped the metal. A sudden, rhythmic thudding started coming from inside the walls, moving rapidly from the ceiling toward the floor behind me. It wasn't a ghost. It was the sound of someone who knew the internal anatomy of this building better than the architects who had built it. I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that the squatter wasn't hiding from me. He was hunting me within the very walls I was supposed to be guarding. I turned to run back to the stairs, but a heavy, rusted filing cabinet had been pushed across the doorway, blocking my only exit from the ward. I was trapped in a room with no windows, and the sound of the scratching inside the ventilation shaft was getting closer and closer to the vent right above my head. I scrambled under one of the heavy iron bed frames, pressing my body as flat as I could against the freezing, grimy floor. I watched through the shadows as the ventilation grate was slowly, silently pushed out of the ceiling, landing on the bed above me with a soft thud. A pair of bare, scarred feet dropped down, followed by a man wearing tattered rags that looked like old hospital gowns stitched together. He didn't look human in the way he moved. He crouched on the bed and tilted his head, sniffing the air like a predator catching a scent. He held a sharpened piece of rebar in his hand, and he began to hum a low, distorted tune that sounded like a nursery rhyme played at the wrong speed. He hopped off the bed and stood just inches from where I lay, his ragged hem brushing against my knuckles. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, praying that the darkness under the bed was thick enough to hide me. He began to walk around the room, systematically stabbing the rebar into the piles of old curtains and trash, looking for the person he knew was hiding nearby. Just as he turned toward the bed I was under, the fire alarm system in the hallway suddenly roared to life. The loud, piercing bells were enough of a distraction that the man flinched, his head snapping toward the door in a blur of motion. I didn't wait for another second. I rolled out from under the bed on the opposite side and threw my entire body weight against the filing cabinet blocking the door. It moved just enough for me to squeeze through, the metal tearing a hole in my uniform jacket as I lunged into the hallway. I didn't take the stairs. I knew he would catch me there. Instead, I ran for the old laundry chute I had seen on the floor plans, a vertical shaft that dropped straight down to the basement. I threw myself into the dark opening, sliding down the smooth metal chute and landing in a pile of ancient, dusty linens 3 floors below. I burst out of the basement doors and ran across the construction lot, not stopping until I saw the blue lights of a police cruiser parked at the convenience store across the street. When the police searched the hospital, they found a literal labyrinth of tunnels and hidden rooms behind the walls where the man had been living for years. They found dozens of photos of every guard who had worked there before me, all taken while they were sleeping or eating. The man was never found, as he had escaped through a drainage pipe that led to the city sewers. But the annex was demolished the very next week. I took a job at a bright, crowded grocery store after that, but I still can't look at a ceiling vent without wondering if there are eyes watching me from the dark. The neon sign for Miller's Fuel and Wash flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz that seemed to vibrate inside my skull as I stared out at the empty expanse of Highway 92. It was 2 in the morning, and the world outside the plate glass windows was nothing but a void of black asphalt and swaying pine trees. Working the night shift at a gas station located 40 miles from the nearest town usually meant hours of mindless silence. But tonight, the air felt thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive electrical storm. I was busy counting the rolls of coins in the register when a pair of blinding headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the grit on the windows as a battered, windowless black van pulled up to the 3rd pump. It didn't park like a normal customer. It pulled up at an awkward, aggressive angle, and the engine continued to idle with a low, guttural rumble that shook the snack displays near the front door. I waited for someone to step out, but the doors remained tightly shut, and the headlights stayed on, beaming directly into the store so that I couldn't see anything behind the glare. After 3 minutes of total stillness, the intercom on my desk crackled to life with a burst of static that made me jump nearly out of my skin. A voice, muffled and distorted as if the person were speaking through a heavy cloth, asked me to authorize $50 on pump 3. I looked at the monitor and saw a hand wrapped in a thick, black leather glove reach out of the driver's side window to swipe a card at the terminal. But the arm didn't look right. It was too long, and the movement was stiff like a mechanical limb. I authorized the transaction, watching the numbers on my screen begin to climb as the fuel started flowing into the vehicle's tank. 10 minutes passed, which was far longer than it should take to pump $50 of gas. Yet the pump didn't click off and the van didn't move. I checked the readout on my terminal and felt a cold knot of confusion tighten in my stomach when I saw that the van had already taken 80 gallons of fuel. A standard van's tank only holds about 30, yet the meter was still spinning wildly, the numbers flickering past like a malfunctioning clock. I realized with a jolt of alarm that they weren't just filling the tank. They were filling something much larger inside the back of that van, or perhaps they were pouring it directly onto the floor of the vehicle. I picked up the store phone to call the local sheriff, but the line gave off a high-pitched, electronic screech that forced me to drop the receiver back onto the cradle. I walked to the front door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle, and shouted through the crack that they needed to move their vehicle or I would be forced to trigger the emergency shut-off. The van's engine suddenly revved, a cloud of thick, black smoke belching from the exhaust, but it stayed pinned to the spot. Then, the driver's side door creaked open just a few inches, and a small, crumpled piece of paper was tossed out onto the concrete before the door slammed shut again. Curiosity and fear fought a brief war in my mind, but the need to know what was happening won out. I stepped out into the freezing night air, the smell of raw gasoline so potent it made my eyes water and my lungs ache. I snatched up the paper and retreated back inside, locking the door and sliding the heavy security bolt into place just as the van's headlights finally cut out. I smoothed the paper on the counter, and my breath hitched when I saw the jagged, desperate handwriting scrawled in red ink. It read, "Don't look at the tires, just look at the pump. They are waiting for you to come outside again." I looked back at the monitor, zooming in on the van's wheels, and realized why the vehicle looked so strange. The tires were completely shredded, the metal rims resting directly on the pavement, meaning the van hadn't been driven there in a normal way. It had been dragged or pushed into position. Suddenly, the power to the entire station cut out, plunging the store into a suffocating, ink-black darkness that was broken only by the dim, red emergency lights over the exit. I heard the heavy, metallic clack of the gas nozzle being hung back on the pump, followed by the sound of several car doors opening simultaneously. I ducked behind the reinforced checkout counter, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure they could hear it through the walls. Footsteps began to circle the building, not the hurried steps of a thief, but the slow, deliberate pace of people who knew exactly where I was and knew I had nowhere to go. I reached under the counter and found the heavy iron tire iron we kept for emergencies, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the cold metal. The sound of scratching started on the glass of the front door, a slow, rhythmic scraping of fingernails or perhaps something sharper. "We just need a jump start," the muffled voice from the intercom said, but this time it was coming from right outside the glass, mere inches from my head. I realized they had deliberately drained the station's power from the external breaker box to lure me out to check the fuses. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, so I crawled through the narrow passage that led to the back storage room, which had a small, reinforced loading window that looked out toward the highway. I saw a highway patrol car about a mile away, its lights off, likely performing a routine speed trap. I grabbed a handful of high-visibility road flares from the shelf and cracked 3 of them at once, the brilliant, blinding crimson light filling the room and pouring out of the window like a signal fire. I thrust the flares through the narrow opening and waved them frantically, the red smoke billowing into the night sky. The footsteps outside the building suddenly turned into a frantic scramble. I heard the van's engine roar to life, a desperate, grinding sound of metal on pavement as the driver forced the vehicle to move on its ruined rims. By the time the patrol car pulled into the lot, sirens finally wailing. The black van was nothing but a trail of gouged asphalt and the lingering scent of gasoline disappearing into the woods. The officers found that the customers had been siphoning the gas into dozens of plastic containers in the back, but more disturbingly, they found a set of heavy industrial zip ties and a roll of duct tape lying right next to the front door. I never went back for my final paycheck, and I never drive on Highway 92 after the sun goes down, because I know that somewhere out there, that van is still looking for a jump start.